The text message came in at 11:37 on a Tuesday night. I know the exact time because I had just set my phone face down on the nightstand, finally done with a 12-hour shift reviewing loan documentation. My eyes were burning. I had 3 tabs of spreadsheets still open on my laptop. I was so tired I'd eaten cereal for dinner, the cheap kind, the store-brand cornflakes that taste like cardboard soaked in regret, and I hadn't even bothered to sit down. I stood at the kitchen counter and ate it straight from the bowl, staring at the wall. Then my phone buzzed. I almost didn't pick it up. I wish I hadn't. You are going to cover what your brother owes, or I will make sure everyone at that firm knows exactly what kind of person you really are. You have until Friday. I read it twice, then a third time. My father had sent that. My father, who used to drive 40 minutes to bring me soup when I had the flu in college. My father, who cried at my college graduation, actually cried, dabbed his eyes with a paper napkin from his jacket pocket. That man had just sent me a threat, in writing. At midnight, I put the phone back down, face down, very carefully, like it was something that might detonate. Then I sat on the floor next to my bed and just breathed for a while. My brother's name is Seth. He's 4 years older than me, which made him the first grandchild, the first son, the one my parents built their entire identity around for a long time before I came along and complicated things. Growing up, Seth was the one who could do no wrong. Not because he was particularly talented or particularly kind, but because my parents needed him to be fine. They needed one success story to point to, and somewhere along the way, I became the backup plan. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I used to when I was younger. I used to lie awake cataloging every piano recital they missed, every science fair ribbon that didn't get put on the refrigerator. Every time my mother said, "Your brother just needs a little more support right now," as an explanation for why there was no money for the school trip I'd been asking about for months. But I grew up. I got a scholarship. I got an accounting degree. I got a job at a mid-sized financial firm in the city where I reviewed commercial loan applications and flagged irregularities and was, by most measurable standards, doing fine. Better than fine. I had a studio apartment with a window that faced east and got real morning light, and I had a savings account I was quietly proud of, and I had built something small and stable and mine. Seth had not done those things. Seth had done other things instead. He'd done 2 failed business ventures, one of which involved the food truck that he sold before it ever operated, and one of which was a consulting firm with a website and no clients. He'd done a string of jobs he left after a few months each, always with a reason, always someone else's fault. He'd done a brief period of living with my parents, then a longer period of living with a girlfriend, then back to my parents when that ended. He was 31 years old, and he was, by the time any of this started, living in an apartment that my parents were quietly helping him pay for, using money they didn't really have. I knew some of this. I didn't know all of it. What I didn't know, what nobody told me, was that 6 months before my father sent that text, Seth had taken out a personal loan using my information, my name, my credit history, my social security number, which he'd had since he helped me set up a bank account years ago, and I was too young and trusting to think anything of it. He had submitted a loan application to an online lender, the kind with fast approvals and high interest rates, and been approved for $9,000. He'd spent it in 4 months. I found out the way you find out about most things that blindside you, not from the person who did it, and not from a warning, but from a piece of mail that arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with a red banner across the top that said, "Past due, third noticed." I stood in my apartment hallway and read the whole letter twice. Then I sat down on the floor. I seemed to do a lot of processing on floors and thought about it very carefully. Because here is the thing about working in financial review. You know exactly what that document means. You know exactly how the process works. You know what a third notice means in terms of timeline, what it means for a credit score, what it means legally. I wasn't confused. I wasn't panicking. I was very, very clear on what had happened and what my options were. I called the lender first. I explained the situation. I asked for the application documents. They emailed them to me within the hour, and I opened the PDF and sat with it for a long time because Seth's handwriting was on the signature line, my name in his handwriting, and there was a photo ID attached that was a scan of my driver's license, which he had definitely taken a picture of at some point without me realizing. So, identity theft, loan fraud, federal crime. I made a folder on my desktop and I labeled it simply documentation. Then I called my mother. I don't know why I called my mother first instead of Seth. Maybe I wanted to be wrong. Maybe some part of me needed to believe there was an explanation, some misunderstanding, something I was missing. My mother had always been the one who could smooth things over, who could find the version of events that made everyone feel okay. I guess I was still hoping for that version. She already knew. I could tell within about 30 seconds. The way she said, "Oh, honey," before I'd even finished explaining. The long pause. The slight shift in her voice to something careful and managed. "Seth is in a really difficult place right now," she said. I didn't say anything. He's trying to get back on his feet. You know how hard it's been for him. "Mom," I said, "he took out a loan in my name. He was going to pay it back." I looked at the third notice on my kitchen counter. He did not pay it back. He got behind. He's going to catch up. It's $9,000, Mom, and it's in my name. That means it's on my credit. That means I'm legally responsible. That means if this goes to collections or further, it follows me, not him. There was a silence that lasted long enough for me to know the conversation wasn't going to go where I needed it to go. "Your father and I think," she said slowly, "that maybe you could help cover this, just temporarily, just to keep it from becoming a bigger issue. I want to be careful here about how I describe what happened in my body in that moment, because it wasn't rage exactly, and it wasn't hurt exactly, though it was some of both. It was more like something clarifying. Like the moment in a dark room when the image starts to emerge from the chemical bath and the shapes become precise. I had spent my entire adult life operating under the assumption that if I was responsible enough, patient enough, reasonable enough, eventually things would balance out. Eventually the family would notice. Eventually it would be fair. The image was fully developed now. "No," I said. And then I asked my mother not to contact me for a few days, and I hung up and I sat very quietly for about 10 minutes, and then I opened my laptop and started making a different kind of plan. The first thing I did was call the lender back and formally report the fraud. I filled out their dispute paperwork that night. I placed fraud alerts with all 3 credit bureaus. I filed a report with the FTC online, which took about 20 minutes and generated a reference number I saved to my documentation folder. I also contacted my firm's legal department the next morning and had a quiet, professional, off-the-record conversation with one of the attorneys there about my options and my exposure. The attorney's name was Mr. Tiny Whitfield, and he had the kind of calm that comes from having seen a lot of messy situations. He looked at the documents I'd brought. He looked at my notes. He said, "You've actually handled this almost exactly so far. That was the most comforting thing anyone had said to me in weeks." I did not hear from Seth. My mother sent 2 texts I didn't respond to. My father sent one that said only, "Call me when you're ready to be reasonable." I was not ready to be reasonable. On the 3rd day, my father called from a different number. I think he borrowed my aunt's phone, and I picked up without thinking. He launched immediately into the speech I had expected, the one about family loyalty and how Seth was struggling and how I had a good job and a good life, and couldn't I just handle this quietly and keep the peace? I listened to the whole thing. I let him finish. Then I said, "Dad, I filed a fraud report. This is being investigated. I can't stop that process even if I wanted to," which was not entirely true. I could have at that stage, but I wanted him to understand the gravity of what Seth had done, and I wanted to see whether he would respond to that gravity with any actual acknowledgement of reality. He did not. "You're going to destroy your brother's life over money," he said. "He used my identity to take out a loan," I said. "That is a federal crime. He made a mistake. Dad, you have until Friday to drop this and cover what he owes, or I will call your firm myself and tell them things that will make your job very difficult." I went completely still. "What things?" I said. He mentioned something vague. Something about my character. Something about things I'd supposedly done years ago that would raise questions. It was the kind of threat that doesn't need to be specific to be effective, just the suggestion of a phone call to HR, of a conversation with a senior partner, of a question planted in the right place. In certain industries, in certain firms, that's enough. I said, "Okay, Dad, I understand," and I hung up. And then I sat with what he had just said. He had just threatened my career, over text and over the phone, to protect a son who had committed identity fraud. He had just told me, in the clearest possible terms, that Seth's comfort was worth more than my livelihood. I thought about the cereal I'd been eating for dinner. I thought about the 12-hour days. I thought about the scholarship applications I'd filled out by myself at 17 at the kitchen table while everyone else was watching TV, because I had understood even then that no one was coming to help me figure it out. I thought about a lot of things. And then I called Mr. Whitfield back. "Here is something most people don't know about identity theft cases involving a family member. The evidentiary process is actually very straightforward when the victim works in finance and has been documenting everything from the beginning. The loan application, the ID scan, the signature comparison, the third-party notices. It's not complicated. What makes it complicated is usually emotion. People hesitate. They give the perpetrator time to move money or dispute the paper trail. They have conversations they shouldn't have, or they fail to have conversations they should. I had not made any of those mistakes. I had also, in the 3 days since I'd first seen that notice, done something that nobody knew about. The lender, the online lender Seth had used, had a fraud investigation team. I had been in contact with them daily. They were interested, professionally, in closing the loop on this case. I had given them everything: the signature comparison, the ID scan, the timeline, the contact information. But I had also, quietly, flagged something else. In reviewing the loan documents, I had noticed that the address on the application, Seth's address, listed as mine, matched the address of the apartment my parents were helping him pay for. And in reviewing that more carefully, I had found something that made me sit back in my chair and close my eyes for a moment. Seth had applied for a second loan. Different lender, same method. A different family member's name this time, a cousin who lived out of state and probably hadn't checked her credit in years. I passed that information to the fraud team as well. I also, and this is the part that still feels very calm and very deliberate when I think about it, I forwarded my father's text message to Mr. Whitfield, the one that said, "You have until Friday to drop this and cover what he owes, or I will call your firm myself and tell them things that will make your job very difficult." Mr. Whitfield read it. He looked at me over his glasses. He said very quietly, "This is textbook extortion." I nodded. "He sent this in writing," Mr. Whitfield said. "He did," I said. Mr. Whitfield set the paper down very carefully on his desk. "What do you want to do?" he asked. I had thought about this. I had thought about it a lot. Actually, over the preceding days, in the quiet of my apartment, in the moments between work tasks, in the 10 minutes I gave myself each morning to sit with my coffee and just think. What I wanted was complicated and also very simple. I did not want revenge exactly. I didn't need Seth to suffer. I didn't need my parents to apologize because I had already come to understand with the clarity of someone who has finally stopped waiting that the apology was not coming. I did not need to win. What I needed was to be done. I needed this chapter to close completely, permanently, in a way that left no room for a sequel. I needed to leave. But first, I needed the documentation to be airtight. I had a friend from college. Her name is Priya, and she works in cybersecurity compliance, who had helped me with something specific in the weeks before all of this came to a head. I had asked her, somewhat casually, whether she knew of any job openings in her field on the West Coast. She had sent me 3 listings in Seattle, 1 in Portland, and 1 remote position with a company based in Austin. I had applied to all 5. I had also, in the weeks before my father's text, quietly updated my resume. I had had 2 phone screens. I had had 1 video interview. I had not mentioned any of this to anyone. On the Thursday before my father's Friday deadline, I received an offer. It was from the remote position, the Austin-based company, and it was a 15% salary increase and full benefits and a title 1 step above where I currently was. I accepted it that afternoon in the 7-minute phone call. Very professional, very calm. That evening, I submitted my 2 weeks' notice at my current firm. I had already spoken to Mr. Whitfield about how to handle the transition cleanly, legally, with no exposure on my end. The fraud reports were filed. The documentation was submitted. The extortion text had been noted by legal counsel. There was nothing hanging over me. The process was in motion, and I was not the one who needed to manage its conclusion. I booked a flight. Not to Seattle, which was where I told my mother months ago that I'd always wanted to live someday. Not somewhere she'd think to look. I booked a flight to Denver, where Priya had recently moved and where she had offered me her guest room for as long as I needed it, and where I had never mentioned wanting to go to anyone. I did not buy a one-way ticket. I bought a round-trip ticket because one-way tickets on short notice are more expensive and I'm an accountant and I couldn't make myself pay the difference on principle. But I did not plan to use the return flight. I gave my landlord notice. I paid through the end of the month. I arranged for my utilities to be shut off on the 15th. I forwarded my mail to a PO box. I packed what I actually needed. Not everything, not the furniture, not the dishes I'd accumulated over 6 years of living alone, not the framed pictures I'd hung with care on every wall. I packed the things that mattered, documents, laptop, clothes for every season, the small things that are irreplaceable. I put the rest in a storage unit under my name, paid up for 3 months. My apartment looked very clean and very empty when I was done. I sat in the middle of the bare living room floor. There's a theme here, I know, and I ate a really good takeout meal, the kind with actual vegetables and sauce that cost too much to justify on a regular night. I had a glass of wine. I looked at the empty walls and the morning light coming through the east window and I thought, I built this. I built all of it. And I can build something else. On Friday morning, my father's deadline, I did not answer his calls. I let them go to voicemail. I did not listen to the voicemail. What I did instead was send a single email. Not to my father, not to Seth, to the fraud investigation team at the lender, CC and Mr. Whitfield, confirming that all documentation was in order and that I was reachable at my current email address for any follow-up needed and providing my new work contact information. Then I closed my laptop, picked up my bags, and left. I found out what happened later through 2 sources, Priya, who had stayed in loose contact with someone who knew my family, and Mr. Whitfield, who updated me once the process had concluded. Seth had not known about the fraud investigation. My father had not told him. I think my father believed, genuinely, that the deadline would work, that I would back down, cover the loan, keep the peace, and everything would reset to the comfortable arrangement where Seth's problems were my problems to absorb. When Seth received contact from the lender's fraud team, a formal notice of investigation because that's how these things work, he called my father. My father told him not to worry. My father then called my mother. My mother called me 17 times over the course of one day. I answered none of them. The fraud investigation moved faster than any of us expected. The second loan, the one against my cousin's identity, had also been flagged by that point, and law enforcement had been looped in. Seth was contacted by investigators the following week. He did not handle it well. He made some decisions in those conversations that Mr. Whitfield, when he summarized the situation for me later, described only as not in his best interest. Seth was arrested on a Wednesday morning. I was in Denver. I had been there for 11 days. I was drinking coffee on Priya's balcony, looking at mountains I had never seen in person before, when my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring. Then another number. Then my aunt's number. Then silence. I put my phone face down on the patio table. I looked at the mountains. There is something about mountains. And I know this is perhaps a little too neat for a real observation. But it's what I actually thought. There is something about mountains in the distance that reminds you the world is genuinely large, that the specific 40 square miles you have been circling for the last several years is not the whole of it, that there are ranges and ranges of things you have not yet seen. I turned my phone back over and texted Priya, who was inside making breakfast, that I was going to need to look at neighborhoods in Denver because I thought I might want to stay a while. She sent back a single emoji, a house. I want to say something about my father because I've been thinking about how to say it for a long time. I don't think he's a bad person in the way that word gets used for people who do bad things knowingly and without conflict. I think he's a person who built a story about his son, a story that became more important to him than the facts, and who kept trying to make the facts match the story even when they couldn't. I think he threatened me because he was scared. Not of me, but of what would happen if Seth's situation finally collapsed completely and there was no one left to hold it up. I understand that fear. I just decided that it wasn't mine to carry. My mother sent me an email about 3 weeks after Seth's arrest that was long and complicated and hurt in specific ways I'm not going to detail here. The short version is, she believes I could have handled this differently. She's not wrong about that. I could have paid the $9,000 and eaten the fraud and let Seth continue, and probably found myself in this same position again in 2 or 3 years, just with different amounts and a worse credit score. I chose not to. I have not responded to the email. I'm not sure I'm going to. Here is what I know about the 18 months before I left. I was exhausted all the time and I thought it was just the job. I had tension in my shoulders that had become so constant I'd stopped noticing it. I avoided certain topics and conversations with my parents with the skill that had become automatic, which is another way of saying I was managing them constantly. And I had been so deep inside that management that I couldn't see the energy it was costing. The week after I moved to Denver, I slept 9 hours a night for 5 nights in a row. The tension in my shoulders disappeared on day 4. I started running in the mornings, the kind of running you can only do at altitude where the air is thinner and your lungs have to work harder and you feel it, genuinely feel it, in a way that's clarifying rather than punishing. I started cooking actual meals. I started reading books for no reason, just because I wanted to. I called Priya's friend about the neighborhoods. I found an apartment with a west-facing window that caught the afternoon light. I furnished it slowly, deliberately, only the things I actually wanted. One afternoon, about 2 months in, I was unpacking the last box. The one I'd been avoiding, the one with the framed photos from my old apartment, and I sat down on the floor to go through them. Most of them were from college, from the years after, from the period of my life I'm most uncomplicated about. There were a few from home, from when Seth and I were kids, before everything calcified into its final shape. I looked at those ones for a long time. Then I put them back in the box, very carefully, and slid it under the bed, not throwing them away. Not yet, maybe not ever. But also, not hanging them on any wall I'm looking at every day. Seth's case is still moving through the legal process. I have cooperated fully with the investigators when they needed information from me, and then I have gone back to my life. I don't follow the updates closely. Mr. Whitfield keeps me informed of what's relevant to me directly. Beyond that, I try not to spend much time thinking about it. My new job is good, the work is interesting, and the team is competent, and the company has the kind of culture where people leave at a reasonable hour, and nobody considers that a character flaw. I've received 2 commendations in my first 6 months. I had my first proper performance review and it was straightforwardly, just genuinely good. I went to a trivia night with some coworkers last Thursday. I answered 3 questions correctly and got 1 wrong about baseball statistics, which I maintain was a poorly worded question. We came in second place. Someone bought a round of drinks. We talked about nothing important for 2 hours. I drove home with the windows down because the Denver evenings are cool even in the summer, and I had the specific feeling, you know the one I think when it's quiet and you're alone and something is just quietly right, that I had not had in a long time. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a few minutes after I got home. My phone had a missed call from my father. I looked at it for a moment. Then I put it back in my bag, walked upstairs, made chamomile tea, and went to bed. I slept for 9 hours. The mountains were still there in the morning. There's a version of this story where I paid the $9,000. I thought about it more than I'd like to admit. It would have been easier in the short term. I would have transferred the money, Seth would have cleared the loan, my father would have called it keeping the peace, and everyone would have gone back to pretending. I would have gone back to my 12-hour days, and my cardboard cereal and my shoulders that never stopped hurting. And I would have told myself it was just the job, just the stress, just life. That version exists. I chose not to live in it. What I keep coming back to when I think about everything that happened is how long I had been absorbing consequences that weren't mine. Not just this loan, not just this situation, years of it. The quiet rerouting of resources and attention toward Seth, the gradual understanding that my stability was something the family drew on rather than protected, the way my parents' fear of his failure had become my responsibility to manage. I had participated in that system for a long time, not because I was weak, but because I genuinely believed that being reasonable and patient was the right thing to do. That eventually the ledger would balance. It doesn't balance on its own. That's the thing nobody tells you when you're the one holding everything together. The ledger doesn't balance. You have to decide to close it. What Seth did was a federal crime, and the consequences of that were his to carry. What my father did, threatening my career in writing at midnight to protect a son who had committed fraud, was a choice, a deliberate one. And it told me, with more clarity than any conversation we'd ever had, exactly where I stood in the hierarchy of things my father was willing to protect. I was useful. I was not precious. That distinction matters. Knowing it matters. It hurt to know it, and then it became the most clarifying thing I'd ever understood about my own life. I think about Priya texting me a house emoji from her kitchen while I sat on her balcony looking at mountains I had never seen before. I think about Mr. Whitfield setting that text message down on his desk very carefully, the way you set down something that has just changed the shape of a situation. I think about the 9 hours of sleep, 5 nights in a row after I left. I think about the tension in my shoulders disappearing on day 4. Your body keeps an honest record even when your mind is busy rationalizing. Mine had been trying to tell me something for years. The choices we make under pressure reveal what we actually value, not what we think we value. Seth valued access to money he hadn't earned. My father valued the story he had built around his son more than the daughter who was actually standing in front of him. I value my own integrity, and I found that out only when someone tried hard enough to take it from me. I am not a cautionary tale about trusting family. I am not a story about bitterness or cutting people off. I am a person who finally understood that protecting yourself is not the same as punishing someone else. Those are two different actions. One of them you do for them. The other you do for yourself. Seth made choices. They had consequences. I didn't create those consequences. I just stopped standing in front of them. The mountains were still there in the morning. So was I. That felt like enough.